Moody's Investor Services has downgraded Nigeria's rating further as a global credit rating agency expects the government's fiscal and debt position to worsen. Well, as the nation's capacity to weather the storm remains eroded by deep-seated institutional vulnerabilities and social challenges, the agency now rates the country a level lower at CAA1, sinking Nigeria even deeper into its non-investment grade from the country's previous and worrisome rating of B3. And to discuss this, well, Arise news analyst Dr. Amadi joins me now. Dr. Amadi, they say when it rains, it pours. You know, Nigerians are saying, can we even catch a break at all? But does this come to you as a surprise, looking at our debt profile and all that has been going on with regards to our foreign direct investments, which is, some would say, almost non-existent in the last couple of years? Well,
not really a surprise, even though it's damaging. Just November, we had a downgrade to B-, and people were worried. Now it's even worse. But again, if you look at the indicators, and the key word there is vulnerabilities and institutional weakness. So the fiscal policy and the fiscal instruments are weak. We've seen the central bank try to shore up using ways and means, which also further creates that sense of risk, credit risk. So for example, if you look at debt to GDP and increasing, even though Nigeria prices have at something percent looks good, but predictions now are going to 45 to 50. Okay, technically many countries have 80% and other, but Nigeria's, if you look at revenue profile, look at debt servicing rate, which is about 50% expected of GDP now, and then almost 100% of revenue to use to service debts. Again, if the per capita income is very low, so essentially the tax revenue available to government will be less. So what they're looking at is, look, if you have this massive deficit, you have this huge debt to GDP or serviceable, and of course debt service to revenue, and then you have not growing per capita, you also have high unemployment. It means that the government's fiscal leeway is very narrow. So less taxation, and then tax comes with its own social crisis. Again, the oil sector, we're not, improving much in that. So the only way out will be non-oil, sectors, which is really not good as well. So how will federal government have revenue to, create buffer for these fiscal frailties? So what this does, two things here. One is that it makes borrowing difficult for us. All the presidents are talking about private sector driven growth, post-election. That would mean we expect a lot of investment from outside the country. Now, with a very terrible credit rating, it makes it difficult to have that level of foreign inflow. Again, it means also that although they didn't think that immediate default is possible, Nigeria has no record of default. But again, once the debt is increasing, your revenue is shrinking, and then of course you are running down to election with all the uncertainties, the chances also of default, or at least fear of a default, increases. So all these would mean that essentially they are not just looking at debt to GDP, per capita income, history of default, also looking at the general macroeconomic environment and then what we call narrative economics, the sense of panic, the sense that the federal government has to depend mostly on central bank and less on tax and transfer. So we see a lot of taxation going on. You also see a lot of revenue coming in and no prospect.
Well, you're talking long term here now, because some would say these issues, it's actually living with us every day. 77 trillion naira is the amount Nigeria actually owes. And yes, you talked about the non-oil sector that needs to do more, but let's not forget that Nigeria's third quarter for 2022 GDP figures actually show that the non-oil sector dominated economic performance by contributing about 94%. That's a huge leap from where we used to be. Obviously, there's still room for improvement. But Sam, I ask you right now, short-term solutions.
Well, first short-term would be, first, get a grip on fiscal policy, not just monetary. Central bank doing a lot, but fiscal policy could mean maybe you cut down on debt, increasing debt. We see, even Tinubu is talking more about we probably could borrow more. Okay.
Even Atiku is saying the same thing as well.
So, but we need to, the debt profile is not good enough if you consider the revenue, and we're not going to improve revenue significantly. Two is that we now need to also deal with some of the non-economic factors that create a sense of fright. So, first thing would be, if you do a good election, no conflict post-election, whoever emerges is able to rally everyone together, then you could begin to improve the perception of risk, especially disruptions that come from policy changes. That's really one of the things, because between now and March and May, you would need to improve the macroeconomic environment. You also need to improve the perception of stability, which is very critical. Then in the short term as well, is people are talking in terms of FRS have reported historic revenue. But people are saying maybe there's also room to improve on tax revenue. But again, that presupposes per capita income, that presupposes some level of improvement in employment, because they're going to tax from income generation. So primarily, I think the first thing to do is to have a more consistent fiscal policy to support monetary policy. And that will be maybe efficiency in use of revenue, less borrowing now, and try as much as possible to ramp up revenue from oil, which, for example, if we're able to export on daily basis up to 1.8 million OPEC quota, or something close to that, will probably increase and then the big one, elephant in the room, the subsidy. Now, if you look at that deficit, a chunk of it could be closed down if you did, but then the question is, how are you going to remove subsidy in a context where you have shrinking income, in a context where you have
high unemployment
and inflation? And so these are headwinds that government, but in the short to medium term, I think what we can do now, let's have a free and fair election, no violence, so that whoever wins can really regenerate trust and change the narrative of fright and fear, and then maybe take control of fiscal policy. The central bank monetary policy has been, in my view, stretched so much to deal with these failures in fiscal policy. It's now time to have a coordinated, coherent fiscal policy to support monetary policy. Otherwise, these ratings will continue to go bad. And the impact will be that investment will not have the kind of investment we need to support the expansionary policy that many of these candidates propose as part of helping with economic growth and stability.
Well, Dr. Amadi, one thing that is sure, whoever wins the next election definitely have their work cut out for them, because the myriad of challenges, and of course, looking at the big one, the big elephant in the room, revenue generation, still very paltry.
Low.
Beyond borrowing, which of course has been overstretched. Dr. Sam Amadi, we say thank you for your in-depth analysis tonight.
Thank you.